The Bengal famine and the nationalist case for food. Hunger is a fierce Durga with innumerable limbs and faces and a boundless appetite. When hunger roams the earth shakes and staggers. She chews up injustice and eats the unjust, and in an instant consumes their intolerable rule. In a decade of global depression, there were few brighter stars in India than the Hindi poet Harivansh Rai Bachchan, a young Allahabad University professor whose epic poem had catapulted him to stardom. Madhushala, a lyrical retelling of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, had offered romance to North Indian audiences eager for distraction as the nationalist movement staggered forward and the poet's readings packed lecture halls across North India. Yet what had changed Bachchan no less than it had changed India itself. It was impossible to write off ardor when famine had ravaged the country. 3.5 million Bengalis had died needlessly of hunger, and in his 1946 Bengal Ka Kal, the Bengal famine, Bachchan had traded love for insurrectionary fervor. Be rid of complacency, he urged India's starving, likening hunger to the ferocity of Durga, Bengal's most revered goddesses. Raise the call of dissatisfaction and sound the cry of revolution. Hunger, Bachchan insisted, offered a transformative power largely unrealized by Bengal's decimated peasantry who had streamed into Calcutta from the hinterlands 3 years prior. Dying on the pavement next to regal hotels, Bengal's hunger marchers had come to Empire's second city to stage a feeble protest against imperial rapaciousness. Few Bengalis believed the British officials who blamed the famine deaths on flood, cyclone, and drought. When rice rotted in warehouses and left on freighters destined for British soldiers overseas, it was hard to see the famine as the consequence of anything but an odious odious political arrangement born on the backs of Bengal's rural poor. A professor of English at the University of Calcutta watched in horror as peasants collapsed next to Gothic colonnades and Art Deco cinemas, vowing that no one who had watched them would ever forget their shameful deaths. Hunger marchers confronted those who had made them hungry and had made them march. Humayun Kabir would write a year later. Their cries rent the sky and at last penetrated the complacency of the masters who toiled under the self imposed talk of doling out freedom and democracy to the colored peoples of the world. As those colonial masters debated how to staunch the political damage wrought by famine, a cloud of rage had settled over the green lawns of Cambridge Trinity College. Since the 1890s, expatriate students had met there to debate the future of their homeland, and Indian leaders of all persuasion quoted the support in their rooms, abutting the great court. Separated by 8,000 miles, news nonetheless galloped from Calcutta to Cambridge. Well before the famine had appeared in the Times of London, it was being debated and decried by Cambridge's Indian students. Late in 1943, it was these students who produced a slim pamphlet on Bengal, authored by Jyoti Basu, a communist firebrand then studying law in London and who would later serve as West Bengal's chief minister. The man-made famine recounted stories of starving Bengalis sharing food with the animals in the gutter, fleeing from British troops who shot at hungry crowds and retreated to feast in well-appointed hotels. Basu did not dwell upon the less flattering aspects of the Communist Party's complicity in British misrule. The Muslim League government in Bengal had been a great deal more effective in organizing famine relief than the party which touted radical food committees but had collaborated extensively with the British administration. But his key assertion was one that Harivansh Rai Bachchan, Humayun Kabir, and Indians the world over could agree upon. Only India's legitimate leaders, the nationalist congressmen held in detention for the duration of the war, possessed the stature and vision needed to prevent famine's recurrence. The unanimous demand of the Indian people today, Basu wrote, is for food and freedom. After decades of marches, boycotts, and strikes in protest of the economic consequences of imperial rule, the Bengal famine marked, in Jawaharlal Nehru's words, the final judgment on British rule in India. As India's citizens and politicians reflected upon the famine, they saw in it the clearest failure of colonial politics and economics, trying the promise of self rule to the project of sustenance for every Indian. Famine had long been central to Indians' understandings of imperial injustice, but after 1943, the elimination of hunger emerged as a nationalist imperative. The ascendance of famine to political preeminence did not preclude a proliferation of visions for how the independent Indian state would function. In the years that followed, Indians imagined their nation as a cooperative socialist republic, a country powered by capitalist industry, a loose confederation of self-sustaining villages, or a modernizing polity that would yoke Indians forward from custom and superstition. But their plans converged around the imperative of providing all Indians with sustenance. Nor, of course, did the famine flatten contentious internecine fighting among Indian nationalists of different hues. But if Congress activists continued to hurl invective at communists for their wartime collaboration, and members of both parties saw the Muslim League as complicit in misadministration and incompetent in delivering relief, these verbs serve to underscore the political centrality that the provision of food and the elimination of famine had come to occupy. Histories of the turbulent decade preceding independence have understated the Bengal famine's transformative effect on Indian politics and national aspirations. These histories relegate the famine to a gruesome wartime footnote, overlooking the ways in which a provincial advocacy was transformed into a key site for political claim making. As a result, the 1943 famine has been used more frequently by historians, economists, and political scientists to advance divergent positions over the causes of famines in general. Amartya Sen's 1981 Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlement and deprivation, famously used the Bengal famine to deflate the notion that famines stemmed from an overall shortage of food, focusing instead upon the role of political entitlements. Subsequent work has largely affirmed this position. Some recent accounts have eschewed more granular work on the famine, deploying it primarily as proof of the British leadership's deliberate mendacity, but a smaller number of sophisticated historical treatments have examined the events of the famine with great care. Paul Greenough's Prosperity and Misery in Modern Bengal, the famine of 1943-44, published a year after Amartya Sen's Poverty and Famines, situated the events of the famine against the backdrop of a longer decline in the Bengal peasantry. More recently, in examining the machinations of starvation and relief more closely and accounting for the violence which beset Bengal in starvation's wake, Janam Mukherjee's Hungry Bengal, War, Famine, and the End of Empire demonstrates with great elegance how devastation long outlived the famine itself. In broadly failing to account for how a provincial tragedy came to be seen as a national injustice, historians have also missed how the larger case for self rule came to be animated by particular material claims. As news of the famine traveled throughout India and the world, Indian journalists, artists, politicians, and planners could articulate with clarity and force the need for an independent government which would attend unfailingly to their sustenance. These claims in time came to be shared by an even broader swath of India's citizenry, animating dreams of how free India might best be governed. Long before independence was assured, the jealous editors of Independent India, true to name, had begun to make plans for freedom. Followers of M.N. Roy, the charismatic expatriate revolutionary who had been a founder of both the Mexican Communist Party and the Communist Party of India, the Bombay-based cadre had published a storm of articles outlining a radical developmental trajectory for the incipient republic. Yet, by the middle of 1943, there were no more blueprints. Reports of famine filled the pages of the broadsheet, crowding out more forward-looking visions. The June dispatch of Vasudha Chakraborty, a young female journalist reporting from Bengal, told of horrors far grimmer than those of India's earlier famines. The province's rural areas were an endless graveyard. Men and women were sneaking into neighbors' plots by cover of night to steal rice and uh, potatoes, meeting death by pistol or fist, while widespread suicides compounded the ravages of starvation and disease. Bengal's tortured countryside contrasted mightily with the venal scenes of private life in Calcutta, where corrupt British and Indian officials made merry with profiteers and society girls in the city's leading hotels. Who is the enemy of the people? Chakrabarti asked as she surveyed the gruesome disparity. Is it the foreigner? Is it the native? Or is it both? The imperialist, the fascist, the profiteer, the corrupt official, or all together? Bengal's revolutionary fervor had made it the site of an insidious territorial stratagem 4 decades prior. Lord Curzon, preparing to divide the restive province in two, decried the Bengalis who like to think themselves a nation and who dream of a future when the English will have been turned out and a Bengali Babu will be installed in Government House, Calcutta. The ensuing partition of Bengal in 1905, aimed at staunching the province's mounting political force, had instead inspired an outpouring of Swadeshi protest, infusing the nationalist movement with new techniques of anti-colonial mobilization. The British were forced to rescind the partition in 1911, but the province's tradition of protest had been uh, sutured to the legacy of divisive communal politics. This fractious political landscape meant that even the most astute observers of the famine struggled at first to meet our responsibility for the mounting death toll. Yet few Indians believed the imperial spokesperson in New Delhi and London, who blamed the famine on the environmental misfortunes of the stormy delta. And the farther gruesome news traveled from Bengal itself, the more Indians and their allies were able to voice what the Famine Inquiry Commission of 1944 would partially affirm, and what economists would demonstrate 4 decades later, that the famine had been both avoidable and man-made. Bengal's major political parties, the Muslim League, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Communist Party, and the Indian National Congress, agreed on little. The debate over how much culpability the governing Muslim League bore for the famine remained a vehement one, and the proclamations of communists were rendered unavoidably suspect by the party's wartime collaboration. Yet increasingly, Indian observers agreed with what Jyoti Basu had asserted in Cambridge, that the real blame for the famine rests on the government, and that government is British. The charismatic Chief Minister of Bengal at the beginning of the famine, Fazlul Haq, had come to power on a populist and grimly ironic slogan of dal and rice for all. Haq, a former secretary of the Indian National Congress who had helped found the All India Muslim League, had campaigned in 1937 on the promise of an end to inequitable land holdings, eschewing what he saw as divisive communist rhetoric. Winning the first provincial elections under the banner of his new Krishak Praja Party, the Farming People's Party, Haq presided over an unstable coalition with the Muslim League before their resignation led to an even shakier alliance with the Hindu Mahasabha. Yet the thundering of provincial politics in Bengal belied the fact that the preponderance of political power in India rested with the colonial Indian administration. India's Governor General managed the province from New Delhi, cooled by wooden fans in the sprawling south block of the Secretariat building. In Calcutta, shielded by the whitewashed balustrades and Cuban palms of Government House, the conservative parliamentarian John Herbert oversaw political machinations from a velvet divan before his death from appendicitis saw him replaced by the Australian political Richard Casey, clad in wing collars and harlequin insignias. These men presided confidently over the complete collapse of Bengal's food position. Burma, by the 1930s, the world's largest rice exporting territory, had long provided a buffer stock for India and Ceylon. Its wartime fall to the Japanese in the winter of 1941-42 deprived Bengal of only around 15% of its exports, but the panic that ensued was more damning. Landlords and traders who had once loaned grain and cash to poor peasants shuttered their godowns. Panicked by the spectre of war, those peasants, no less agitated, looted paddy to plant and eat. These problems were compounded by the abuse of infrastructure. Bengal's trucks shuddered under the weight of trains ferrying rice to soldiers and industrial workers, and fearful of a Japanese invasion, British officials confiscated boats and bicycles along the coast in a maladroit denial policy, obvious to their role in moving grain. In Delhi, the central government busied itself with organizational filibuster. In March 1942, the Department of Education, Health and Lands convened a conference to debate the best ways of encouraging greater wartime production, agreeing on the initiation of a Grow More Food campaign and the formation of a Central Food Advisory Council. But before that council met for the first time in August, an exasperated Fazlul Haq had already written to Delhi urging a recognition of the rice famine in Bengal, a mention that itself was assuredly too late. Meanwhile, India's political landscape was descending into its wartime nadir. 6 days after Huck's letter, the failure of the Cripps mission to secure Congress support for the war effort led to the declaration of a Quit India movement. Within hours of issuing their demand that the British leave India immediately, nearly 60,000 Congress leaders and activists had been arrested, many remaining in detention until the war's end. The spindly casuarina trees fringing the Bengal coast did little to impede the ferocious cyclone that made landfall near the village of Kontai in October 1942. Tens of thousands of residents of Midnapur district died in a region already racked by political disorder. Many of the district's police stations had been burnt down, and thousands of jailed activists watched the storm from their prison cells. The enterprising civil servant B.R. Sen, later Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, watched the storm from his veranda in Calcutta. Days later, he was surveying the remains of villages which had been washed away in preparation for relief efforts. In defiance of a district officer who gloated that the unruly province had received what it deserved. Sen quoted the support of groups like the Friends Society of Britain and the Ramakrishna Mission to clear corpses and repair embankments, but no relief team could replant the Aman or winter rice crop washed away by territorial rain, nor could anyone scrap the green paddy of the devastating fungus which grew in the cyclone's wake. Midnapur, once verdant with rice, was a waterlogged graveyard. Its blight portended miserably for the troubled province. A week before the end of the year, a group of underground Congress organizers circulated an insurrectionary leaflet across Bengal urging activists who had stayed out of prison to rise up. There is famine. The leaflet's author declared, "Why are our people, the worker, the peasant, the city poor, starving or semi-naked or living in horrid conditions? Because the British administration is so corrupt that there is no equal to it." British censors did their best to confiscate flyers like these, yet they struggled to contain popular outlets like the Hindustan Times, where a January cartoon showed a British food expert who had arrived in India promising a solution to Bengal's food problem. Instead, he was too sidetracked by a massive buffet to notice a swarm of groveling peasants. If this cartoonist had thoroughly lambasted British officialdom, he would have had nothing more charitable to say about the American propaganda film produced that same season, which showed Calcutta dock workers unloading a feast of dried eggs, canned apples, corned beef hash, Tootsai rolls, and Skills beer for army canteens. Hunger was not merely Bengal's purview. Smaller shortages had pockmarked Malabar and Travancore throughout the war, and relief workers fretted that the scale of Bengal's deprivation would divert scant resources away from their hungry districts. A team of Bombay Congress activists who had stayed out of prison likened India's hunger marchers to those in Milan and Florence, said to be protesting in a similar manner. Both were fighting against the abuse of foreign fascists. In each case, the activists proclaimed, "Such usurpers are They do not see the monster of hunger that they themselves have created, and it will not be very long now when this monster takes a jump and crashes upon them with a bang. Those usurpers were, in fact, watching the monster of hunger with alarm. In January, Calcutta's municipal government wondered if rationing the city would help staunch the arrival of hunger marchers. In Delhi, the central government issued some lame promises to check prices and facilitate transportation of grains while reminding provincial governments that food was ultimately their concern. And in London, the war cabinet belatedly took note of India's serious food shortage, establishing a department of food after 2 centuries of rule. Yes, this shuffling did little to calm matters at home, where the new statesman and nation noted the British government was facing an enemy more formidable than Congress, famine. Bengal, never quiescent, was a hotbed of political quarreling as much as a scene of ghastly starvation. Calcutta's streets were lined with corpses and the province's rice prices were sky high. Meanwhile, Fazlul Haq had been hounded from the chief ministry, replaced by Khwaja Nazimuddin. A new Muslim League ministry formed in April saw the new famine strategy lead by the prominent and incompetent political H.S. Suhrawardi. As district officers appealed to Suhrawardi to direct grains to famine areas, the new civil supplies minister focused doggedly on the hoarding he believed to be responsible for shortages. The raids and invective of his anti-hoarding drive, however, simply drove stocks farther away from the market. Bengal's political opposition was livid at Suhawardi's unwillingness to declare a famine and thereby invoke the famous famine courts, and the appointment of the Calcutta tycoon MAH Isfahani, an ardent Muslim League supporter, as the sole dealer of rice in Bengal was proof, if ever there were, that the League would rather repay political patrons than manage a worsening catastrophe. The political atmosphere was poisonous. Bengal's communists, the Krishak Praja Party and the Hindu Mahasabha assailed the impuissant Muslim League, demanding the release of the detained Congress leadership and the formation of a unity government in the name of relief. Yet that term held vastly different meanings for Bengal's opposition parties. The Hindu Mahasabha, lacking a robust provincial base, used this call to piggyback on popular support for the Congress. Its premier, Shama Prasad Mukherjee, decried the Muslim League for conspiring with the imperialists to starve Bengal.